This is the second part in a series of 3 videos about planning lessons for progression in D&T. The videos support chapters 12, 13 and 14 in section 3 of the 4th edition of Learning to Teach Design and Technology in the Secondary School, and this is a core text for all those training to teach the subject. Each video will be released on a weekly basis over the next few weeks. The final video release will be followed by a webinar, a conversation about teaching D&T, where you can meet the 3 authors and raise specific questions for discussion. So my chapter was on Key Pedagogies and Design and Technology, and welcome to this second video in the series with myself, Matt McLain. My chapter aims to support beginning teachers in understanding how D&T is taught and learnt. There are many different definitions of pedagogy, as well as many different approaches and interpretations. But in this presentation, think about it as the theory and practice of learning, teaching and assessment. In this chapter, I'll begin by talking about what is unique about D&T education and follow that up with a discussion about key pedagogical approaches, how we approach teaching and learning in the subject. And following that and unpicking pedagogical approaches, I look at teaching and learning as a whole class and thinking about techniques such as direct instruction and demonstration, teaching and learning in groups, including teamwork and group work, and teaching and learning as individuals, focusing on D&T projects. Following that, I have a discussion about practical activities in D&T and how they're organised and managed, including extended projects, designing and assessing, managing projects effectively, and your role supporting and challenging pupils in D&T. And these are the areas I want to focus on in this video. At the beginning of my chapter, I introduce 3 fundamental activities in D&T: ideating, realising and critiquing. And you might be asking, well, why am I not using designing, making and evaluating, which are more commonly used within the subject? And the reason for that is I want to disrupt the reader's thinking and get away from some of the stereotypical approaches to designing, making and evaluating, or certainly interpreting those 3 activities, because it's too easy for us to think about designing as drawing or sketching, and think about making just simply in terms of using tools and materials, or evaluating as being something we do at various points, like evaluating products when we're researching and evaluating our product at the end of the process. These 3 activities should be going on through an iterative design process all the time, so we're going backwards and forwards. And when we're in the middle of realising, when we're in the middle of modelling and making, we can also be ideating, we can also be addressing problems, and through that we're also critiquing. So these 3 work together rather than being separate entities. I also introduce 2 additional processes, communicating and knowing. And communicating is more than just sketching, drawing and graphical communication. It also involves us using verbal and written communication in D&T. And in terms of knowing, a big part of the way that we know in D&T is by acting and doing stuff, but also researching, going and finding things out, learning how to find things out, learning how to make decisions about what is useful information is important within design and technology. Next, I talk about a concept called an expansive restrictive continuum, and this is something I encourage all teachers, particularly beginning teachers, to think about, rather than just simply thinking I'm doing this kind of activity, but thinking about what we're doing with that and how at times we might be wanting to restrict our focus. For example, we want to demonstrate a practical process, we want to restrict that down because essentially we want pupils after the demonstration to go and replicate what we've done. Whereas at other times we want to be more expansive. For example, when we want children to be creative and to come up with their own ideas, and we can use different approaches. But also for each of the different strategies, we can have more expansive or more restrictive approaches to those. So we can have a more expansive demonstration, and we can have a more restrictive approach to generating design ideas. So it's a different way of looking at things rather than simply thinking about particular types of activity. And it's similar to the concepts around scaffolding And scaffolding, if you take the metaphor from the building industry, scaffolding is used to support a structure as it's being built. And in the same way, we as teachers want to put a different strategy in place to support our learners, but we need to remember that scaffolding, like scaffolding on a building, is going to come down at some point, and the building has to stand on its own. And using some educational terminology, that concept where you're starting to remove scaffolding is called fading. So you need to be thinking about, do you intend to restrict learning activity to focus on a particular skill or aspect of knowledge, or do you want to expand the learning activity so pupils are going to develop autonomy? And rather than just simply thinking about different types of activities, add in that extra dimension of the expansive restrictive continuum. Both are valid approaches, so it's not as if we want to move away from restrictive. We use restrictive approaches when it's appropriate, when we want to develop those very particular skills and knowledge, but we want also to be helping children to become more autonomous in design and technology, to build on their capability. In this video, I want you to start thinking about signature pedagogies in D&T. The term comes from work by Lee Schulman in Learning the Professions, and he describes signature pedagogies as characteristic forms of teaching and learning. And when he looked at how the professions were taught, and since he brought out those ideas in the mid-2000s, he talked about three different structures: surface structures, deep structures, and implicit structures. And these were described as, on the surface structures, those concrete or operational acts of teaching and learning, showing and demonstrating, questioning and answering, interacting, withholding, approaching, withdrawing. So all of those activities and approaches that we use in the classroom to engage children with our subject. And then the deep structure are those sets of assumptions about the best ways to impart a particular body of knowledge or know-how. And I would propose that in D&T, the general assumptions that we make about how the subject is taught, the way you see it taught most frequently in schools, is through D&T projects. And then the implicit structures, what sits below, is thinking about the moral dimensions and the beliefs about the professional attitudes, values and dispositions that signature pedagogies develop in learners. And on the next slide, I'm going to explore that a little bit further. So it's important to say that signature pedagogies are pervasive approaches. They're not necessarily the best or the only, but the most commonly used, not just in single institutions, but across the whole sector. And it's a useful tool for us as teachers discussing what's important within our subject and starting to question why it's important and should it be important indeed. And I would say within the deep structures of D&T projects, there are four signature pedagogies in D&T. We've got designing and making, and that's been around for a long time, and that's talked about a lot. We've got mainly making, so it has to be focused particularly on making. We've got mainly designing, that is probably a bit newer in our lexicon within D&T, and thinking that sometimes we want to be just designing, where we're not restricted by the amount of time, the tools, the equipment that we've got available to us, because even designing and making is going to limit creativity somewhat because of those factors: time, resources, and equipment, and so on. And then the fourth, exploring technology and society, and thinking about what impact technological choices have on society and how society uses technology to develop. So thinking about that, let's explore that. If we think about teaching models and methods, and we put them along an expansive restrictive continuum, you might look at teaching methods like demonstration, which is a key pedagogy in D&T, as tending to be more on the restrictive side, and moving through things like life cycle analysis. Again, a little bit more open for expansive activities, but again, relatively restrictive. Product analysis, similar, we can start to ask questions or really question things. Then get into more towards the more expansive side, we might think about user-centered design, start to think about others' needs, and so on. And design fiction as quite a new approach within design and design education, where we can use fiction as a tool for exploring those difficult or intractable problems that some people call wicked problems. And then putting back in there the idea of the 4 signature pedagogies within the deep structure, mainly making. It's going to be quite restrictive because you're focusing on particular skills, particular processes, materials, and so on. Exploring technology and society could go backwards and forwards along this continuum, but I've popped it somewhere to the restrictive side of the centre. Designing and making, again, that could be swapped with exploring technology and society, depending on how we frame a designing and making activity, but we need to remember that there are always going to be limitations when we've got any designing and making, and those limitations are typically the time we've got, the resources and materials we've got, and the expertise that's available to every pupil in the class through you as the teacher or technicians or other adults in the classroom. And mainly designing, I've put on the expansive side, because we can free ourselves then from looking at what we know we are able to do or what is possible. We can start to think about new possibilities, new futures, and so on. And each of those approaches have advantages and disadvantages, and they bring something to the D&T table. And it's up to us to think about how we use a wide variety of those approaches across a key stage to build a really rich and diverse experience for children when we're teaching them in the classroom. Then sitting underneath that, we might think about attitudes and values and dispositions, and these are by no means extensive, but for example, we might think about accuracy, and developing accuracy might be on the more restrictive side because we want to be accurate. Ethics and ethical thinking, we might consider different ways of thinking about ethics, but again, we're thinking about things which are particular approaches and making judgments about things. Resilience and developing resilience through designing and making might start to become a bit more expansive, and innovation and creativity. We want to be expanding young people's minds and their thinking. If you want to read a little bit more about signature pedagogies, I've written a blog post about this on my blog, and you can follow the link https://bit.ly/34xHRUM, and you can read a little bit more, and you can download that diagram that I used in the previous 2 slides. If you have a copy of the book Learning to Teach, Design and Technology in Secondary School, you might want to pause the video at this point and read pages 208 to 215. That's the beginning of my chapter. And these address issues around signature pedagogies and the expansive restrictive continuum. And pages 215 to 227 begin to address pedagogical issues of teaching whole classes, teaching groups, and teaching individuals. If you're a student teacher, you might also want to have a go at tasks 13.1 and 13.2. Also, tasks 13.3 and 13.4 might be useful when you're observing D&T lessons on placement. Before I begin to talk about the D&T project, just a quick word on what is possibly the most common pedagogical approach in D&T, and that is the demonstration. It does tend to be more on the restrictive end of the continuum than expansive. It's also a form of teacher modelling and explaining. Now, you can have more expansive approaches to modelling and explaining. So, for example, if you're wanting to model to children how to generate ideas, how to be creative, then that's going to be more expansive. Whereas if you're demonstrating a particular skill, then there's going to be certain factors, like there may be right or wrong ways to do it. There might be issues around safety, and there might be issues around quality and accuracy. So demonstrations tend to be more on the restrictive side. And demonstrations would sit possibly within the more broad category of direct instruction as a particular approach to teaching, not just in D&T, but more broadly. And if you want to read more about that, have a deeper read in the chapter. All demonstrations are going to be planned. So even what you might call a spot demonstration, where you hadn't planned a time for it in the lesson, but you spot something going on, you think, okay, right, I need to call everyone back round, I need to do a quick demonstration to get people back on track. You should even be thinking, particularly as a beginning teacher, about planning those and being aware of when those might be needed. In the chapter, I talk about 3 basic types: front-loaded, just-in-time, and after failure. And again, read about those in the chapter if you want to know it. If you don't have the book and you want to download that table about the 3 types of demonstration, you can do so by going to https://bit.ly/377 capital O 3 capital C T. So thinking about managing practical activities. For a long time in D&T, we've had these 3 different types of activity: the design and make assignment, sometimes called design, make and evaluate assignments, the focus practical task, or more recently people have talked about focus practical projects as well, and investigate, disassemble and evaluate activities or ideas. You also need to think about different levels of supervision. So that will depend on the age, experience and capability of the pupils. You need to think about health and safety as well. As you can see in the picture there's a hot glue gun. The approach you take to that will be different for a group of Year 7s than it will be for an A-level group. And you want to think about levels of supervision. So for low-risk activities, where it's unlikely that any harm is going to come to the children if they're working in their places, on their tables in the room, then you would call it general supervision. If there's a medium risk, you want to have more close supervision, so you might want to think about zoning, about where pupils are using things like knives, drills and so on, and how you locate yourself and how you can see and supervise those areas. And then there might be activities that you want one-to-one supervision, and that could be either you, a technician, or a teaching assistant is going to be supervising those, but those are things where there is a high risk to pupils using the equipment and those pupils around them, things like heat treatment, guillotines and so on. And you may choose not to use those items within lessons if you risk assess that and you think the risk is too high. So you need to be thinking about those when you're planning to teach, and you can read more about health and safety in the chapter within the Learning and Teaching book on health and safety in D&T. You need to think about, when you're planning, how are materials or resources accessed. So are you going to be having pupils coming to a particular place in the room to collect tools, equipment, materials, components, ingredients, whatever, or are you providing those in their places? Is it going to be in a form of a kit of parts, or do you want them to go and pick things up, like pick them up from a store where you're getting each item as you need it? And there are advantages and disadvantages to those. And similarly with tools, think about where those are located. Are they in a tool cupboard? Are they in drawers? Are they in racks, in a cupboard or on tables? And those things will affect how pupils move around in the room, which can affect how you manage and supervise lessons. So the D&T project. So I've proposed already that the D&T project could be considered as the deep structure of D&T, and within D&T projects you'll use some of those surface structures to foster the fundamental activities of ideating, realising and critiquing. And that might be utilising things like demonstrations, product analysis, and some of those other approaches that I've mentioned earlier and I've written about in the chapter. And some elements that are common to D&T projects can include, not necessarily all, but some of these things that are listed. So project management and planning, exploring context and requirements for a project, generating ideas to a design problem, developing design solutions, making prototypes, evaluating ideas and prototypes, and you can be doing those things at various points within a project. And thinking particularly about extended projects, they're most likely going to be for examination groups like GCSEs or A-levels. They provide opportunities to apply knowledge as well as developing creativity, resilience and autonomy. So things like teaching children to avoid design fixation. So getting them beyond the first thing that comes to their mind and them getting fixated on that and different techniques. So a really good research paper on that is by McLain and Nicola. I do recommend, if you've not read that, that you read that. There is a tension for us as D&T teachers between authentic learning and assessment accountability. And you need to be asking yourself, when you're making choices, particularly when you're making choices which might be the more restrictive end of the continuum, are you doing that to make your life easier, or are you doing it to access higher grades for you or the learners? There's nothing wrong with that per se, but it can have an impact on children having the opportunity to take risks, to fail, which is an important part of designing and making, and so on, or using that to scaffold learning and to support learners. So do ask yourself, what is it you're doing when you're making choices within extended projects, and also how are you preparing children in advance. So at Key Stage 3, are you giving them opportunities to engage with projects, to manage a project for themselves, so they don't come to a GCSE project and then suddenly realise that they've not been taught how to manage a project? So in summary, in the chapter I talk about 3 fundamental activities in D&T: ideating, realising and critiquing, supported by 2 key processes: communicating and knowing. I talked about the expansive restrictive continuum, thinking about how we can be reining in or reining out to give more flexibility and freedom, and not thinking about that as we have it restrictive at the beginning of a key stage and more expansive at the end. That's a bit of a simplistic way of looking at it, but all the way through our teaching there's going to be times we want to be restricting things down to focus on particular knowledge and skills where that's appropriate, and at other times being more expansive, giving children the opportunity to be more creative and expansive in their designing, making and evaluating. We talked about the signature pedagogies of designing and making, mainly making, exploring technology and society, and designing and making. We talk in the chapter about teaching whole classes, groups and individuals, and we talk about extended projects. And I encourage you to think carefully when you're planning those, to develop pupils' autonomy and think about how you're preparing young people in advance to engage with those extended projects. And be making intelligent choices about pedagogical methods. So what methods are going to help and support the children as they're learning, as they're working through an extended project. Thank you for taking time to watch this video on my chapter, Key Pedagogies in Design and Technology. It is the second of 3 videos, and it's contributing and leading up to the webinar, a conversation about teaching D&T with Sarah Davies, myself, Matt McLain, and Alison Hardy, who's also the editor of the Learning to Teach book. If you want to sign up for the webinar, go to https://bit.ly/3LG W N6 U. Thank you for listening.